Today we have a special guest speaker from Pcmatic, Corey Munson, and I'm going to turn it over to him now. It's all yours, Corey.
Thanks, Howie. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us and for inviting me to speak on a topic that I spend a lot of time traveling the country, maybe more so virtually within the last year. But this is a particular topic that I've been speaking about for a better part of the last 5 or 6 years. To give you a little background on Pcmatic and myself, Pcmatic's a company that's been around for well over 20 years now. And you may know us by our national TV ads where we promote our antivirus and security products for home use. What you may not know about Pcmatic is the fastest growing segment of our business is our work with small and medium-sized businesses, state and local governments, school districts, even the federal government on similar security issues. So we continue to have a very large consumer presence, but the fastest growing segment is our work with companies like many of which you represent. Me personally, I've been with the company for 16 years. My focus is I am Vice President of Marketing, but I spend a heck of a lot of time speaking to groups, large and small, about topics that directly relate to the security products that we have on the market today. My intention today is to not give you any type of sales pitch for what we do. I'm happy to have that conversation with you offline, but to talk about the issue of ransomware, it obviously is top of mind for many business owners and IT leaders, even small business owners who don't happen to be IT leaders. And I'm happy to talk about a lot of the research we do internally, but we work with a lot of third-party organizations as well and have some access to some insight and to some research that's being done by third-party organizations around ransomware. One of the things I've spent a lot of time in the last, I would say, year or so doing is meeting with a lot of law enforcement organizations and representatives from the Secret Service to the FBI to local law enforcement discussing this topic specifically, and we can get into some of the insights that they've been able to share. So I'm logging in today from Las Vegas. My connection is not great, so Mike is driving the presentation. I'll ask him to advance the slides and we'll go from there. So Mike, if we can go to the next one. So the agenda, I really want to cover these topics and then leave it wide open to plenty of time for a Q&A. One, we'll talk about the fact that this is now an epidemic. I don't use that term lightly, given what we've all gone through in the last year. But this is truly an epidemic, and it's growing in concern. I want to define what ransomware is. I'm still finding that some people don't fully appreciate what ransomware is and why it's different than a conventional computer virus. We'll talk about what is fueling ransomware. This is the other thing that a lot of people are not aware of, is why it's becoming increasingly a bigger and bigger issue, how it's happening, what to expect next from future variants of ransomware, and how you can prevent some of this. I'm not here to suggest that there is a silver bullet, but I will present to you some things to consider in terms of how you can take steps to at least make it less likely that you'll have to deal with this. Next slide, Mike. So let's start here. This is a slide that I've been using for the past 5 years as I've traveled the country talking about ransomware. And each time I gave a new presentation, I was simply copying and pasting new headlines about ransomware attacks. Well, I figured after about 3 or 4 years, I was just running out of space to add most of the headlines. So I've tried to zero in on just some of the more important ones. Recently, many of us are probably familiar with what happened with the Colonial Pipeline. If you weren't impacted directly in having to be in line for fuel, you probably read about it and realized they had to pay $5 million. If you follow the news and saw CNA, one of the largest insurance companies in the country, recently paid a $40 million ransom. Just this morning, I saw news of a media group that was hit with a ransomware attack that pulled their media offline. And even an organization out east that's responsible for ferries was hit, and the ferry service was now limited as a result of a ransomware. There's really no limit to who's being hit or the severity of these attacks and the problems they're causing. Next slide, Mike. So let's start here with what ransomware truly is. And again, I think some people still have a misunderstanding. The ransomware is a computer virus that if you encounter it, you can simply walk your computer into Best Buy and have the Geek Squad remove it, and you're back to whole. That is not what we're dealing with here. Ransomware is malware that encrypts all of the data on your PC, and it cannot be unlocked without a key. And the only person with access to that key, with very, very few exceptions, is the attackers who are demanding ransom for that key. That ransom demand now becomes much more complicated, and we can talk about the different levels of extortion that are happening. But this is the important thing to remember about ransomware. The data cannot be unlocked unless the ransom demand is met and you get access to the key that only the attackers have. We think about 70% of ransomware attacks right now are impacting small businesses. 55% of small and medium-sized businesses reported that within the last year they were hit with ransomware. And I think these are very conservative numbers. These are just publicly reported cases, which in talking to a lot of law enforcement, they think this is understated. 1 in 5 small businesses that are hit with ransomware will typically be forced to shut down. We're talking about a life and death situation for many of these companies. There are not many options on the table. Now, the screenshot you see there is an actual screenshot of a ransomware screen. So if you were to plug in a computer on a given morning and see this pop up, you're probably in for one of the worst days of your company history, because this is the initial stage of a ransomware attack. A few things worth noting on that particular screenshot. You'll see in this case, there's a countdown clock that says how long you have to pay the particular ransom demand in this case. And in some cases, if you don't hit that initial demand for ransom, they'll increase the ransom demand and give you a new clock. You'll notice down in the bottom left-hand corner, they actually offer customer service about how to pay these ransom demands. There's a customer service link that if you want to engage with their customer service teams, they've got people you can speak to on the phone and negotiate the ransom. This is a full-fledged business operation. We'll talk about how that's a key in how ransomware is growing. But this is what it typically looks like, and this is that initial wave of what the attack is going to look like to someone who's being hit. Next slide, Mike. So not only is the data being encrypted now, and this is where it becomes much more complex, what we're finding is that the attackers are not only encrypting the data and holding that for ransom, but they're harvesting the data. They understand what data is being encrypted, and they're taking that next step in threatening to make that information public. So there's a couple of let's call it phases to the ransom process typically. One, that initial ransom demand asking for money in return for getting the data back. In many cases, if that ransom demand is not met, the next thing you'll see is a ransom demand with a threat that they will make that information public. And they can publicize that in any number of ways. They can publicize that on the dark web. They can publicize that on any number of websites they simply set up on their own. And there are really no limits to what information they are willing to share. So the ransom demand will typically go up based on their advancement in what they're willing to share publicly. We think that as many as 77% of ransomware attacks now involve this level of data exfiltration, is what you'll typically hear it referred to as. This is that threat of releasing the data, not just encrypting it, but releasing it. And to further complicate the matter, you're now seeing triple extortion. You're seeing the organization is being hacked, that initial ransom demand, the threat to leak the information publicly, but then in some cases, the attackers will reach out to customers and partners of a company that's being breached and reach out to them individually letting them know that they have personal information that has been compromised via the initial company that was hit, and threaten those customers and partners individually. So that's really the other complicating factor here. It's not just involving the company that's being breached. It's now dealing with those customers and partners of that particular company. If you are following the news, you saw a good example of this where the Washington, D.C. Metro Police were recently hit. And what we saw was the next step of ransom demand there was the threat to release personal information about police officers within the Metro D.C. Organization, which actually happened. The personnel files for most of the police officers in Washington, D.C. were released. Psychiatric profiles for these police officers were released. And in some cases, there was a threat to release information about police informants as well. Now, I don't know a heck of a lot about organized crime, but I've watched Goodfellas and Sopranos enough to know that the last thing you want is to have information about informants out there for public consumption. And that's exactly what was being threatened. The ransom demand was going up, and the demand and the threat now was not only the data was encrypted, but we're going to release all that information publicly. A couple of other cases of how this is playing itself out. In one case last October, 40,000 there was a 40,000 patient psychotherapy clinic in Finland. And what happened there was they emailed the patients directly, demanding smaller amounts of money, or else they would leak their therapist session notes publicly. So again, the clinics hit, they get one wave of ransom demand. The second piece was they reached out to the patients and said, we have the notes from your sessions with your therapist. If you don't pay us individually as a patient, we will release that information publicly. So what's that worth to you as a patient? Another example, in the UK, and this actually played itself out in California as well, we saw that hackers were releasing stolen data from large cosmetic surgery clinics, threatening to release before and after photos of patients of these cosmetic surgery clinics. So all sorts of different variations of how this is being done. I just want you to understand that the data exfiltration piece is unique. It's more and more common now, and it's becoming definitely a complicating factor. Next slide, Mike. So here's what's fueling ransomware that a lot of people don't fully understand. It's critical to understand that this is now a viable business model. You do not have to be a sophisticated computer hacker to get your hands on the software needed to infect someone with ransomware. Right now, for roughly $10, or else I'll give you an example here in the screenshot of less than that, you can go out and purchase the software code necessary to infect anyone, an individual or a company, with ransomware and generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue. Now, I'm not a finance guy at heart, but if I'm spending $10 and getting a return of hundreds of thousands of dollars, that seems like a good, profitable, viable business model, and that's exactly what's happening. You don't have to be sophisticated in your understanding of technology or hacking to get your hands on what is necessary to actually launch a ransomware attack. This is what we refer to as ransomware as a service. There are organizations out there that actively sell this software code out on the dark web, and 2/3 of ransomware attacks in 2020 were launched using this ransomware as a service. On the right-hand side of this particular slide, this is an actual screenshot from the dark web of a ransomware kit that is for sale. I think in this case, the screenshot was from last year sometime. It was $4.99 in the equivalent of Bitcoin. You can purchase this particular kit to go out and launch a ransomware attack. You just need to figure out how to deploy it and figure out how to infect someone with it. Now, the beauty of this particular offer is it comes with all the customer service, even tells you exactly how to craft the language around emails that you may use to potentially deliver the ransomware. In this case, it even mentions that if you want to load this onto a USB stick, it has a countdown clock. So if you load a ransomware code onto a USB stick, drop it in the parking lot of a major corporation. Someone takes it into the office, plugs it into their device, and all of a sudden that countdown clock begins of maybe 24, 48 hours later, it starts deploying the ransomware. So unfortunately, it's way too easy to get your hands on this and to make use of it. The other reason this is now a viable business model is the number of people that are actually paying the ransom. And as a marketing guy at heart, if I'm doing any type of marketing where I'm getting a rate of about 45 to 60% of people are converting into paying customers, that is really, really effective. So we think that it's somewhere between 45 and 60% of people that are being attacked are paying the ransom, and then roughly 73% of small businesses are paying the ransom. So it's easy to get your hands on. It's cheap. You know you can generate a lot of revenue with this. You have the support system built in automatically here. It's a turnkey support system to take care of things on the back end. People are paying the ransom, and there's no lack of victims, and the market continues to grow. It's really a matter of imagination and who you want to target. So it is a viable business model, and this is why it continues to grow. Until this is choked off in one way or another, and we'll talk about maybe some efforts to stop some of this. Until this stops, ransomware will not stop. It's highly profitable and easy to deploy. Next slide, Mike. The other thing that's fueling ransomware, we'd be naive to think that there's not some nation state involvement here. And it's usually coming in a few forms. If it's state sponsored, it's usually for purposes of economic infrastructure or even election disruption. It's a distraction from something bigger and more complex that a nation state happens to be doing. So ransomware in some cases just simply acts as a cover. I think the important thing to understand now about nation state involvement in ransomware is the nations that we see most of this evolving from happen to be nations and countries that we don't have a great relationship with in terms of being able to extradite any criminals that we would actually be able to pin to any of these ransomware cases. So more than it is nation states actually launching the attacks themselves, they're kind of turning a blind eye to much of this. And we think that as much as 90+% comes from Eastern Europe. So you saw the Biden administration just this week talk about putting a little bit more pressure, it looks like, on Russia to crack down on some of this. And we think that that's where most of this evolves from. But it doesn't seem to be the nation states themselves that are doing that. They're simply, like I said, turning a blind eye. All right, Mike. The other complicating factor, and we talked about this early on, is cyber insurance, which if you don't currently have it, I'd highly suggest you go out and get it. But a few things to consider about the role cyber insurance plays as it relates to ransomware. Number one is the fact that we're seeing a lot of insurance companies turn away from this. And as a long-term fail-safe, it doesn't look like cybersecurity insurance is going to be available in the long term. It's no longer sustainable. One of the larger insurance providers in the world, their CEO is on record in the last month saying he doesn't think it's sustainable going forward. So it is a good fail-safe. It is obviously something important to be able to fall back on if you are ever in the position where you have a ransom demand that you wouldn't be able to meet, and it means life and death for your particular company, but it may not be around much longer. But the complicating factor we've seen from a security standpoint with cyber insurance is we've seen some suggestion that companies that have cyber security insurance are actually being targeted because they have policies. And we've seen examples where insurance providers are publicizing the names of some of their customers that are holding these policies. And not long after that information becomes public, those companies are actually being targeted because the attackers realize they have insurance and they have the money to pay the ransom. So don't overlook the fact that that is a factor driving some of this. The other thing that we've seen, and this was a direct result of a conversation I had with a Secret Service agent that happened to be a part of ransom negotiations in one ransomware case. And this was a chat negotiation back and forth with the attackers trying to negotiate the ransom down. What happened was about halfway through that negotiation process, the attackers were able to produce a screenshot of the victim's company's cybersecurity insurance policy that showed the exact limits of that insurance policy. And on the spot, in the middle of the negotiations, tripled the ransom demand because they had done their homework. As they encrypted that data, they were looking for any proof that that particular company was insured. They found that proof and then used it as further leverage during the ransom negotiations to demand even more. So again, I'm not going to suggest to you that cybersecurity insurance is a bad idea. It is not. But understand that it's definitely complicating matters because it's reinforcing the idea that there is money that can be used to pay these ransoms. And in some cases, the mere fact that you are insured is being used as further leverage in the ransom negotiations. All right, next slide, Mike. So how is this happening? Right now, it looks like approximately 90% of attacks are delivered through email. It's still, for all the sophistication that exists out there as it relates to hacking and cybersecurity, it's still typically someone clicking on something they shouldn't be clicking on. On the left-hand side there, you'll see what we've all probably seen is one of these Amazon emails that come through that are cleverly disguised to look like something that you should be clicking on. And this is how we're seeing most of this delivered. There are some exceptions to that. We've seen this evolve over the last year as people are working from home increasingly, that there are some remote exploits as people are logging in remotely that are being taken advantage of to deliver ransomware. But still, the majority of it seems to be coming through email. Increasingly, what we're seeing is, think back over the years, how many times have we heard about a data breach? Equifax, Target, you name it. It's a safe working assumption that our personal information in one form or another is out there for sale on the dark web. And what is happening is they're using that personal information to make these phishing attacks, these emails, even more convincing, even more personalized, and even more compelling to click on. And we're going to see more and more of that. Something we'll talk about is called laser phishing, where it's just very well crafted phishing attacks that have a lot of personal information that are almost impossible not to click on. Next slide, Mike. So the other element of how this is happening, and this is always one of my favorite slides as I give this presentation, is there's definitely an element of carelessness and lack of what I call a cyber mindset. These two young men here on the slide, I believe they were either 8th graders or 9th graders in Michigan. And the story is these two gentlemen had access to the logins, the passwords, the phone numbers, the locker combinations, the lunch balances, and grades for all 15,000 classmates in their particular school district. They could view teacher tests, answer keys, and email messages. They could control the district's security cameras remotely and operate them remotely from their laptop computers. And if that wasn't enough, the boys were using the district servers to mine for cryptocurrency. Now, were these two kids, and they were 10th graders, I take that back, they were 7th graders. Were they these cyber geniuses that are spending all their time preying on companies and hacking? No, they walked into the school library one day, and there was a Post-it note on one of the computers in the school library that had the username and password that the IT administrator had left behind inadvertently. We're making it way too easy in many cases for these things to happen. And this is a prime example. There are many great security solutions out there, but like I tell many people, Why spend all this money on these sophisticated security solutions if you're not going to do even the basic things? And we see that increasingly. People that don't spend a lot of time thinking about passwords, they're not training their employees. They're not doing the simple things. And that is what's also driving this lack of cyber mindset. And this is definitely a piece of a bigger, broader strategy that's going to eventually knock down ransomware, is a change of how we're thinking about our everyday activity as it relates to being online. Next slide, Mike. The other reason this is happening is the security tools we currently have in place on many of our computers right now simply fail. 3/4 of people that are ransomware victims said that they were running updated antivirus software with their computers. And these are a couple of charts done by some third parties that simply ask the question, have you been hit with ransomware? And if you have, did you have updated security procedures in place? And which security procedures were in place? Or in the case of on the bottom there, what brand antivirus software were you using, and did it stop a particular ransomware attack? Most security software that's installed on a computer that you buy off the shelf right now is not able to stop many of these ransomware attacks. And the main reason this is most of the security software is built on an antiquated approach to stopping computer viruses. It's based on an old 80s approach of taking a list and tracking a list of all the known viruses out there as they come into existence, pushing those definitions out to the computers that they're trying to protect. And if one of those viruses attempts to execute, it'll stop it from executing. The problem with that is these viruses are evolving and morphing every roughly 50 seconds. So it's no longer practical to think that you can have a list of all these viruses and have it updated enough to be able to protect your endpoints, your desktops, your servers, your laptops. It's just no longer practical. It's evolving way too quickly, and too many of us are depending on this old technology to protect us against things like ransomware. So this, again, a complicating factor. Next slide, Mike. So these next few slides, I'll spend some time giving you some insight into what I think is coming next as it relates to ransomware, because this isn't going away. Again, it's a viable business model. It's highly profitable. It's easy to deploy, and there's no shortage of people willing to pay. So if that's the case, what should we be looking for next? Number one, backups are absolutely necessary. They've saved any number of companies that have been able to do backups right. But just as we were showing with cyber insurance or cybersecurity insurance policies, there's another side to the story. Increasingly, we're seeing that backups are now becoming infected and encrypted as well. These attackers are becoming sophisticated enough to be able to find the backups as they're working their way through the network and encrypt those backups, just like they're encrypting the data that are on the main devices. We've actually seen ransomware out there in the wild that attacks even shared network drives and shadow copies and files that have backup file extensions. They've even found ways to be able to sync with a victim's cloud backup as well. So it's definitely not completely common, but it's again a caution that I offer that backups have been probably offered up as the way to prevent ransomware. It's not a way to prevent ransomware. It's a way to react to it, and it's not always a great way to be able to react to it, and not super reliable right now. So look for that more and more, that these backups will now be infected. Next slide, Mike. We talked about it a little bit, but the evolution of these phishing emails. And again, these are the emails where we see most of the ransomware is being delivered via these emails. There's a company out there, maybe some of you use it for cybersecurity awareness training, called KnowBe4. They're actually a $1 billion company. There are a number of great cybersecurity awareness training companies out there. We happen to have a relationship with them. But in talking to their CEO, I was talking about what the future of these phishing attacks will look like. and he has taken to referring to it as laser phishing. This is this open source intelligence, he calls it, in combination with the personal information that's already available for sale at pennies on the dollar out there about all of us. That used in combination with open source intelligence to make these emails virtually impossible not to click on. And by open source intelligence, what I'm suggesting is it's the information that's being shared every day out there on social media. That information is being leveraged against people that are really the next victims of ransomware. Been able to easily spot what their potential passwords may be, or understand where a potential attack vector might be. But again, if these emails are going to be virtually impossible not to click on because they are so sophisticated, what do you have in place beyond that? How are you training your employees? What security is in place? What's the password policy? What's the policy if someone were to call and try to run a scam over the phone? All things that need to be considered because these emails are going to become more and more sophisticated. Next slide, Mike. The other element of this is going to be what evolves into what I think we can call extortionware as it relates to mobile devices. And I'm kind of surprised this hasn't happened yet, but we've started to see it. Primarily, ransomware is going to involve desktop, laptop computers, and servers. But as you think about how many people have mobile devices, it's only logical that the ransomware that extends to mobile devices opens up a whole new market for ransom demands. Let's give you a couple hypotheticals. Ransomware happens to infect your phone. The next thing you see on your phone is a demand that your entire phone has been encrypted. If you want to be able to decrypt it and have access to your phone again, pay us $500 in the next 24 hours. If that's not already happening, and we think it's happening to some degree, it's going to happen on a wide scale basis in the years to come. Let's take it a step further. Not only have they encrypted all the information on your mobile device, they're also threatening to take all the information that they found on your phone and send it to everyone in your contact list. There's another $1,000 ransom demand. Let's go further. They've harvested all your pictures on your phone, and they're going to demand an additional $2,000, or they will send all of the pictures that they have found on your phone out to the dark web and publish a link for everyone that's one of your contacts to be able to go out and see every picture that is on your phone. Now, let's assume that most of us don't have anything to worry about as it relates to pictures on your phone, but those that may are going to pay that ransom pretty quickly. So this is this next evolution of ransomware demand. It's going to become much more personal. We'll continue to see major corporations targeted government organizations, but watch for it to find its way into personal attacks as well, because there's money to be had there. Next slide, Mike. And lastly, in terms of what's next, the Internet of Things. I can give you a couple of examples, but digital cameras, self-driving cars, wearables, medical devices, all these things that are connected to the internet are conceivably an attack vector for something like ransomware. I gave a presentation to a group of city officials out in the East Coast last year about ransomware. And after the presentation, I had a city manager from a city in, I believe it was in Washington State, come up and say that their city had recently been hit, and the attack vector was a digitally connected, internet-connected parking meter on the street of the city. That's how the ransomware got in. We've seen cases recently where a Tesla that happened to be in the parking lot of a corporation that was connected online to the company network was the attack vector for a ransomware attack. All of these things that are connected are potentially an attack vector for ransomware to get in. And as this continues to grow, just look at your own homes. Go take a hard look at how many things in your home are connected right now. Maybe it's an Amazon Echo, maybe it's a gaming device, streaming devices. All of these things are potential attack vectors, and they're usually very, very poorly secured. One of the things we looked at over the last year is we sent all these people to work from home, kind of collectively as a nation and as a world, but we haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how to secure those people at home, because most people's network security at home, their Wi-Fi password hasn't been updated since the cable guy installed the internet 10 years ago, right? These people are sitting ducks at home, and if they're spending most of their time doing work now from home via these same networks and via these same poorly secured laptops in some cases, again, it's just making it that much easier for ransomware to propagate. Next slide. So prevention, I get this question all the time as I go out and present about ransomware, and I always suggest start with the basics. It's easy enough to be distracted by the next big shiny security object that's being sold. But what I suggest to everyone is let's take a step back and think about what are the simple things that can be done that are typically very low cost, that don't involve a lot of resources. If they're not being done already, why? And what steps to take to address it. Number one is training. If you as a business owner right now are not making a concerted effort to train your employees to better spot phishing attacks or better deal with business email compromise or CEO fraud, you're really doing a disservice to your effort to stop something like ransomware. So I would definitely suggest looking at training as an option. There are any number of very good free resources to do your own in-house training. This isn't something you have to go out and invest in a third party to run for you. I mentioned Know before. They've got great free resources for you to put something in place on your own, but there are other great resources as well. But you've got to make it a priority, and you have to make it ongoing. The studies say that in most cases, people will forget after about 20 days if you train them on cybersecurity. Every 20 days or so, you need to be reinforcing what your employees need to be looking out for. Backups. If you have in-house IT or you're doing this on your own, hopefully your IT folks are sophisticated enough that they know to store your backups separately and to practice recovery simulations. We've seen a lot of companies that are hit with ransomware attacks that don't test their backups until it's too late and realize the backups never worked. They were never set up right to begin with. So that's a great question to ask your IT department, or if you happen to be outsourcing any of your IT, is tell me about our backups. And when was the last time we tested accessing that data? Multi-factor authentication. Most of us have had to implement this on our own personal bank accounts over the last few years. If any of your accounts have multi-factor authentication as an option, do it and do it right away. Again, it's free. It's not overly complex. It's something that can be done in a matter of minutes, and it goes a long way towards stopping people from being able to walk in the front door, essentially, without much effort. And finally, and this is where my company spends most of our time, is your endpoint protection. We talked about how weak most antivirus software typically is right now, but there are better ways to approach how you protect these endpoints. Our approach happens to be, and this is the only pitch I'll give for Pcmatic, is we lock endpoints down. Instead of assuming here's a list of all the known bad viruses, try to keep that list up to date and block one of these viruses if they happen to pop up on a computer. We take the inverse approach. We lock everything down, and unless we know it to be good, we don't allow it to execute on an endpoint. It's typically referred to as application whitelisting or application allow listing. We're simply assuming that everything is dirty. Everything is potentially a compromise. And unless we know it to be good, we're not going to allow it to happen. Now, this isn't just Pcmatic suggesting this is the best approach. These shields down below are all the different organizations that are recommending the same approach from an endpoint protection, but they're also recommending the training and the other steps from Department of Justice to the FBI and beyond. But the critical thing to consider here is these are good preventative steps that can be taken right away without significant investment. Unfortunately, what we've seen within the security industry over the last few years has been this kind of idea that this is going to happen. It's only a matter of time, and all we can do is figure out how to react to it. We're here to suggest is no, it's not an either or proposition. You have to be prepared to react. You have to know what you're going to do if you're ever hit with something like this, but not at the expense of at least taking the simple steps to put in place that could potentially prevent it, and do it at half the cost of the more reactive steps, or worst case scenario, actually having to pay the ransom. All right, Mike. So I moved through it rather fast because I wanted to have plenty of time for questions and answers. This is all of my contact information. I'm happy to have offline conversations about any of these topics. We can even get into talking about our products and how we work with end users. We work with managed service providers as well. One of my suggestions to small and medium-sized business owners is if you don't happen to have in-house IT right now, and you haven't already engaged with an outside company to manage this for you, now is the time to do it. Now is not the time to be cutting corners on it. And it's tough. I'm sure you all know it's tough to recruit IT talent, even if you want to stand something up internally. But there are a lot of great managed security service providers that'll come in and provide a kind of a turnkey solution. You don't have to worry about how the sausage is made. But this is all of my contact information. It'll get you to me directly. The URLs up on top will take you to my company page. We'll take you to our blog, where we blog a lot of about our research and a lot about the conversations we have about these topics. I'm a big LinkedIn person, and that happens to be my email at the very bottom as well. So I'll open it up to questions, and happy to address any concerns you might have.
Hey, Corey, great presentation. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. I understand, the diligence in being, with employee training, password policy, tightening. What are your thoughts on penetration testing? Is it for a mid-sized company? Is it a good approach? What should we expect from a penetration test, basically?
Yeah, my position on that is if you can afford it, it's a really good idea. What we're coming up against is many small and medium-sized businesses that can't afford it. If you engage with these companies, these MSSPs that are offering things like penetration testing, it can get very costly. Is it important? Is it a good idea? Are you going to get a lot of great information that you can potentially turn into action and take some steps as a result of what this pen testing shows? Definitely. But it's a matter of what you can really afford. I think the other thing would be, if you're going to do the pen testing, how willing are you to act on what the results are? I've heard any number of stories about companies that do the pen testing, but then never make any changes. There was a story in the press about the Colonial Pipeline attack, where they had done a security review that I believe involved pen testing about 4 or 5 years ago. And at the time, the company that was part of the consulting firm that did the pen testing said that even an 8th grader could have hacked into the pipeline at that point. So great that you want to do the pen testing and take that step, but unless you're willing to take the added steps of putting in place the recommendations that come out of that, it may not be worthwhile.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Corey, this is Mike.
Mike.
Typically, if my company was hit, we reloaded a backup and we were up and running. What is the likelihood that in that backup that we reloaded, that there's a time bomb, that there's something in there that's going to time out and do it again?
Entirely possible. We don't see a lot of it. I think what we've seen more of is that more than there being some sort of time bomb, and most good security companies, most good IT professionals will be able to try to look for that. But what we've seen is some companies are being hit again. So if they've paid the ransom once, let's not be shocked that they're now a target for the second and third attack. And in some cases, we've even seen school districts that have been hit 3 and 4 times. So more than it being a time bomb issue, it was you're now on the list of those that can be attacked. And if you happen to be one of those that actually paid the ransom, you're on the hot list of those that are actually willing to pay too.
But shouldn't somebody who's been hit look at how they got hit and try and fix their defenses around that?
Ideally, yes. Unfortunately, we're not always seeing that be the case. We're seeing that some companies are simply content to get back up and operational because it is desperation mode, obviously, if company operations are brought to a standstill. But we have seen cases where companies have been able to recover, but then never put any added steps in place. In many cases, a prime example is many companies will never change something as simple as the antivirus or the security software they're using once they've been hit. They still continue to use the same one. So that's the working definition of insanity, is continuing to do the same thing and expect different results. Unfortunately, we're seeing some of that.
Well, if you're saying all the current antivirus software is no good out there, what are we supposed to go to?
And let me be clear on it. I don't suggest that it's no good. What I suggest to anyone is there's no one silver bullet. It has to be used in conjunction with any number of pieces of a broader security approach. You need the training. You need good password policy. You need a solid antivirus that's also supported by something like what we do. You also need a solid backup strategy. You need good policy in place for your workers that you're sending to work from home that are plugging in on their personal devices or on their personal networks. It requires a bigger, broader approach to security more than just one single thing that's going to stop this. And unfortunately, I think too many people have relied on that there is just one thing that can take care of this. And that's one of the reasons we are where we are right now. It has to be broader than just one thing.
Do you have a recommendation for, a small company, say 3 and less computers? I mean, what are they to do? If, McAfee or any of the others aren't that great, where do they go? They go out and buy something else that's more expensive just to spend more money?
I don't think you necessarily have to spend more money, but you do have to do some due diligence to understand what is. There are some that are better than others. There are third parties out there that test these antivirus products and these security products and make that information available for public consumption. As part of Biden's recent executive order, there's some talk that there's going to be some standardization around making some of this information more publicly available about how effective these security products are. It's crazy to think that companies and organizations and school districts are relying on these products and they don't really know how effective they are. Well, some of that information is out there and it's worth chasing that information. And I can send you links to the testing houses that evaluate these companies and these products. But I think that's part of it is we need better transparency to understand what's working and what's not working. We need better conversation, between IT professionals to understand what's more effective, how these companies are being hit. And we're seeing some of that, and we're seeing talk about this, but it's still in its kind of infancy stages. But the first thing I would do is do your homework and take it very seriously. It doesn't always involve spending more money, though.
Corey?
Hi, Mike.
Hi. Good pitch.
Thank you.
So Windows versus OS, any difference?
Historically, OS has been virus-free, right? We're seeing some indications that that's not the case. that there are some vulnerabilities there, but historically Windows has been the problem child and continues to be the majority of the issues out there right now. We happen to have a product that runs on Apple devices. There are other good products that'll run on Apple as well, but the Windows devices are really the main concern. And most of the ransomware, most of the stuff that's out there, they're targeting Windows devices.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thanks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, one more comment. I have so many logins and passwords to so many different websites and devices, and I ended up having to go to a notebook and write them down because I figured if I created a file and said passwords on it, that'd be the first file that they'd hit. So by having it handwritten on a piece of paper, I figured that was better than creating a file somewhere on some computer and putting all my passwords. And then, Google asks you every time you change a password, do you want to save it? Is that really a great idea? They can get hacked.
Yeah, true. There are even password managers out there that some people use. Those have shown to not necessarily be foolproof either. So writing them down is not a horrible idea as long as it's somewhere safe and locked away or somewhere that you only personally have access to. As it relates to passwords, what I usually suggest to people is spend more time in how complex you're making these passwords. More so than where you're storing them or anything like that. Spend an equal amount of time trying to figure out how to create a better password. And it can be things as simple as, one strategy I've heard is a lyric from a favorite song. Spell out part of the lyrics of your favorite song as your password and misspell one word or invert one phrase or something like that. Again, simple, costs you absolutely nothing, but spend some time with how complex these passwords are. The other thing, as it relates to being potentially an employer and dealing with employees, is we see that in some cases as many as 80% of people are using personal and work passwords across platforms. And this is a big problem as well. If we go back to the data leaks, Equifax, Target, all these are leaking passwords as well. So if you've got employees out there who have personal information that's exposed, and that personal information includes their passwords, but they're also using that same password for their company accounts, that's a problem for you as an employer. Because if I've got access to that personal information on the dark web and I can buy it for pennies on the dollar, and I decide I want to come after you as a company, I'm going to find a list of your employees and I'm going to go find their personal information. And I'm going to see which one of those employees are using that same personal password for the company password. And then I walk right in the front door. So what are your requirements as a company, as an employer, about passwords? How often do they need to be changed? How complex are they? Is multi-factor authentication in place? So you definitely want to think about where you're storing all this information. It's always a good idea. But what is your broader password policy is something to look at.
Hey, Corey, great presentation. Could you elaborate a little bit more on when you said emails that are almost impossible not to open? Are those like
Sure.
Amazon saying your order is here, please click on it? Or what are you seeing?
It's exactly what it is. It's going to be a combination of things. It could be Amazon. It could be any number, disguised as any number of things, a FedEx receipt, a UPS receipt. But what they're doing is they're taking this personal information, we go back to this again, and they're using that as part of the email. So let's say they happen to know the name of your children because that information is out there, or they know your last 5 known addresses, and they include that as part of the email. anything else that is personally identifiable that they can add to that email is going to increase the likelihood that you're going to click on it. Now, the next generation and the next wave of this, there's been some speculation that they're going to start being able to harvest your browsing history. So let's think about this. If they're able to get access somehow to your browsing history and know that you were at Amazon and you did purchase something at Amazon within the last 24 hours, and they know what that item is, if I want to target you, it doesn't take a lot to craft an email with a link that's going to potentially launch a ransomware attack that looks like a receipt for that Amazon transaction you just made. So then it's on you to be able to make sure that that is really from Amazon, to be able to look for the red flags within some of these emails that'll give it away. But again, they're becoming so good and it's so full of personal information that usually people will click on it because they figure, who else would have this information other than somebody I'm already doing business with, or I've already provided that information to. So any number of ways that it will become more and more difficult not to click on it, but it's that personal detail that you're going to see embedded into these versus something that looks just kind of generic that they're just hoping you click on.
So Corey, it's Mike again. So the old days, it was the old exe files that you didn't want to click on, right? So is it just opening an email that would set you up as a target, or is it being dumb enough to provide information in response to an email?
You know, there's some of that at work, Mike. The exe stuff is still the primary driver, and that's what our software happens to look at, is executables. But we also look at, they have what's called fileless attacks that don't necessarily require something to be clicked on. It can be scripts that are associated with Office. I don't want to go too far into the weeds on this, but there are definitely things beyond just simply clicking an email that could potentially infect you. And I think where you're going with this is, we still see these cases where it's the social engineering attacks, where they'll call the administrative assistant for a CEO and try to disguise themselves as being the IT provider who just needs access to her password because they've got to be able to update the payroll software. You know, things like that. Time and time again, you're seeing people just hand over the keys of the kingdom and say, sure, here's my password. And then you're gone, right? The CEO fraud. You know, we continue to get, even as a security company, we're hit with emails like that all the time, asking, disguised as being from our CEO, asking that we wire money, millions of dollars across the world. That's happening all the time, and on a daily basis, companies are falling for it, and people aren't looking far enough into these emails to see where they actually came from. Or even stopping to think, does this email even sound like something that my boss would have put together? I've worked for him for 20 years and I know how he talks or she talks and how they craft their email messages. Does this look like something that would come from them? And am I going to take that added step to confirm that that's really what he wants or she wants done? Again, this is some of the simple stuff that if we're doing, we can stop a lot of these things from happening without investing a heck of a lot other than some time.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Corey, one of the things I noticed over the past year or so is that the tech companies are sending out email saying, beware of phishing schemes, beware of ransomware, beware of this, beware of that. Click here to read more. How do we know that's not coming from somebody that's running ransomware that knows Pcmatic or whatever the technology company is?
It's a great point, and it's definitely a possibility. One of the things I typically suggest is come up with your reliable sources of information. And if you even have a doubt and get an email like that, there's no reason you can't go directly to that site and try to find that same information. If you receive an FBI alert tomorrow in your email inbox and it seems fairly legitimate, go directly to FBI.gov and dig out their cybersecurity recommendations. Don't click on the email to get there if you have a doubt. It's a healthy level of skepticism is what ultimately is going to help everyone here. And there may be a level of inconvenience here. I warn people, for so long, we built security around, we don't want to interfere with business operations.
Yeah.
We don't want to interfere with efficiency of business. The problems are far too serious now. We've got to put that to some degree on the back burner and be willing to deal with the inconvenience of having to take some of these added steps to verify emails or verify requests from executives, or even run software that's going to be a little bit more of a lockdown and require some more permissions and things like that. If we're willing to do that, we can make some headway here. But if we continue to insist that none of these things can happen and potentially interfere with the normal flow of business, then we're going to continue to fight an uphill battle here. There's going to be a level of inconvenience and added time. Maybe it's one extra click onto a website versus the email. Maybe it's one extra call to verify that someone actually wants money wired.
I've talked to FBI agents on exactly that issue, and all of them say, when in doubt, give us a call. It takes us about 2 minutes to verify if that person really is with the FBI.
Exactly. To underscore that point even further, and I'm meeting with this gentleman. He happens to be keynoting a conference Monday down in South Carolina. He's a retired FBI agent from their cybersecurity division. He got a chance to speak to him. He's in the process of writing a book, or he just published a book. And his contention is that 90% of what's happening out there right now can be prevented by doing these simple things. And he said he saw it time and time again over the course of his career. It was people were either, not doing the simple things with passwords or multi-factor authentication or training their employees. He's adamant that 90+% of this could be stopped.
All right. If there are no more questions, shall we call it a night?
Yeah, I'd just like to say thanks again for having me. I always enjoy talking about this because I think it's important to be able to educate the public about what's really happening. These headlines are going to come fast and furious. There will be no stopping. It's just critical that you each take a look at where you fall on that cybersecurity threat spectrum. Don't just assume because you happen to be a small business or don't have a lot of employees that this will not potentially happen to you. It's better to operate from the assumption that this is an ongoing threat and take a look at what steps you're willing to take to prevent this from happening. But also know that there are some simple things that can be done that aren't going to be very cost prohibitive or even resource intensive, that'll go a very long way into helping you. And if you can't do it internally, there are some great managed service providers, great managed security service providers who can step in and help. And if you need any references, or we've got networks of them across the country that we deal with firsthand, we're more than happy to make introductions for you, or even just guide you to some of these best practices we've talked about. I can give you some more detail on that. Reach out. I'd be happy to help any one of you.